Hello everyone and welcome back to Next Gen Gaming for round 7 of the Star Wars Unlimited 4K here at SCG CON Richmond. Today's feature match features the final 2 undefeated players. We've got Paul Heaver on the left, piloting Han Blue, and then Blake Edmondson on the right, piloting Sabine Green. Of course, we have all become very familiar with Blake. Here at the feature table, we have had him the last 5 rounds. He has been on fire, winning all of his matches here at the feature table and looking to remain undefeated. A new challenger. And Paul Heaver has come to the table with Han Blue, and Paul's Han Blue has really been talked about more than just about any deck we've seen so far in the tournament. He is undefeated up to this point. And Paul did defeat a Sabine Green last round. In round 6, we had 4 undefeated players remaining. You had Paul Heaver versus Cass Lynn. And then we had Blake Edmondson versus Patrick Flynn, which we saw here at the feature table. And Paul was able to take down Cass and Sabine Green to remain undefeated, so we'll see if Paul can have the same kind of success here at the feature table against Blake. Now we see the turn 1 plays. Paul starting with the initiative, playing the restored arc. And then Blake following up with a Battlefield Marine, choosing not to use the Sabine activation, since he knows that Paul can just restore that damage with the restored arc. So on turn 2, Paul is going to come out with an Ezra Bridger. Ezra is a great turn 2 play for Han Solo. And then Blake is going to fire out a Fleet Lieutenant, and that is going to allow the Battlefield Marine to crash into Paul's base for 5 damage. Now, Paul will come back across with the restored arc, 2 damage onto Blake's base, and he will heal 1 damage from his own base. So we've got 4 damage on Paul's base, 2 damage on Blake's base, and Blake will claim the initiative. Now, Blake has defeated one Han Solo here at the feature table today, but that was Han Green. And I think Han Blue could prove to be a much more difficult matchup for Blake and Sabine, considering that Paul has access to so much healing in his deck. He has 3 copies of Yoda, Kanan Jarrus, Luke Skywalker, Restored Arc, Repair, Make an Opening, and Vigilance. So he has access to a ton of healing. And I have a feeling that Blake is going to have to deal a lot more than 30 damage in each of these games to claim the victory. And to start turn 3, it was a super strong play for Blake. He played General Dodonna, which protected both the Fleet Lieutenant and Battlefield Marine from straight up being attacked and defeated by Ezra. So Paul having to change the plans here a little bit on this turn and attacked the General Dodonna with Ezra to put 3 damage onto Dodonna. Blake comes back across with 3 damage using the Battlefield Marine. Make an opening into play for Paul that was able to defeat the General Dodonna and heal 2 damage from his base. But then we saw 3 more damage from the Fleet Lieutenant. Paul coming back across with Restored Arc, 2 damage onto Blake's base, restoring 1. But of course, Blake not done yet with this turn. He uses the action ability on Sabine, 1 damage to each base, deploys Sabine, and then another 3 damage to Paul's base. So a pretty explosive turn for Blake, which is what you're looking for on turn 3 with Sabine. The Sabine deploy turn. And Paul has 12 damage on his base, 5 damage on Blake's base. And Blake is in complete control of the ground arena. Paul does have the initiative here to start turn 4, and he's going to start the turn with a Han activation using the action ability on his leader, being able to take a card from his hand and put it into play as a ready resource. So 3 damage to Blake's base with Sabine. Paul is going to deploy Han, and here comes the Steadfast Battalion. The epic action on Energy Conversion Lab is used. Steadfast Battalion enters play with Ambush and will one-shot the Han Solo leader and deal 1 extra damage to Paul's base on top of it. So a super nice play for Blake. In response, Paul will attack Blake's base for 2 with the Restored Arc and heal 1 from his base. But 3 more damage on Paul's base with the Fleet Lieutenant. And Paul just trying to slow things down a little bit. Will play a Waylay, returning the Battlefield Marine to Blake's hand. That allows Blake to claim the initiative, and then Paul will play Repair and heal 3 damage from his base. Paul has healed a decent amount of damage already in this game, but he still has 15 damage on his base. And he is staring down an extremely dangerous board as he sees Sabine leader unit and Steadfast Battalion in play for Blake. And Blake is going to take advantage of the opportunity while he has it. Steadfast Battalion will attack Paul's base for 7. Getting the on attack trigger once again with Sabine in play, becoming a 7/7 on attack. 22 damage on Paul's base. Paul in a tough spot. He is going to use the Han Solo leader ability again, getting an extra resource for this turn. And here comes the second Fleet Lieutenant for Blake. He will attack with Sabine. That's 5 damage to Paul's base, 27 damage on. He has to answer the ready Fleet Lieutenant, and he is going to play Han Solo, ambush the Fleet Lieutenant, but Blake is going to play his favorite card once again, For a Cause I Believe In, and it will finish the game. Blake has taken game 1 here in round 7 at SCG CON Richmond. Players have shuffled up, and we are ready to go for game 2 here in round 7 at the Star Wars Unlimited 4K at SCG CON Richmond. Blake is off to a fantastic start here in round 7, winning game 1 and looking to close things out here in game 2 against Paul Heaver and Han Blue. Again, both of these players coming into this match undefeated, looking to be the last undefeated player through the rounds of Swiss. We have just 1 more round to play before the cut to top 16. Both of these players have played so well today, and they both have very likely already secured a spot into the top 16. But it would be a great feeling for them to remain undefeated and carry that momentum into their top 16 match. Both players deciding to mulligan their opening hand here in game 2. Now for Paul, I would be willing to bet that the copies of Devotion and the additional copy of Takedown has probably found its way into the deck from the sideboard. Paul will certainly not need restock in this matchup, and Vanquish also feels a bit slow against Sabine. Now for Blake, this is not the start he wanted in game 2. He missed a turn 1 play, just simply claimed the initiative on turn 1. We saw that Paul used the Han action ability to get an extra resource and play Yoda on turn 1. Now on turn 2, Blake has found a unit to put on the board, Fighters for Freedom. But this is such a rough start for Blake going against Paul and his Han blue deck that just has so many ways to heal damage from his base. Blake is just going to claim the initiative after Paul uses the Han action ability again. He's got 4 resources, and on turn 2, he is going to play Kanan Jarrus. A turn 1 Yoda and turn 2 Kanan Jarrus for Paul here in game 2. That is an absolute dagger to Sabine. Blake is going to take 2 damage from Yoda's attack, and the dice fumbled all over the table. That's what happens when a Sabine player misses a turn 1 play. It just gets them absolutely flustered. They don't know how to handle that because it is so unusual. But here on turn 3, Blake will have the initiative. And my goodness, does he have a big problem on his hands and an absolute wall of healing to get through in Paul's ground arena. Blake is going to start the turn attacking Paul's base with the Fighters for Freedom. 3 damage onto Paul's base. And now Paul trying to decide if he wants to instantly remove the Fighters for Freedom with Kanan Jarrus, and that is the action he will take. Kanan Jarrus will defeat the Fighters for Freedom, and the on-attack trigger will discard Heroic Sacrifice, and that is 2 damage that will be healed from Paul's base. And in response, we are going to see K2SO on Blake's side of the board. Paul still has all 4 resources ready, and he has the Yoda ready to attack also. He's going to go 2 more damage into Blake's base. That's 4 damage on Blake's base, and Paul will heal all of the damage that was on his base. Blake is going to deploy Sabine. Once again, not being able to take advantage of the action ability, considering the healing capability that Paul has right now. Paul has just claimed the initiative. And now Blake has a decision to make. Does he attack Paul's base for 3 damage, or does he take out Kanan? And it looks like he will attack Kanan Jarrus, defeating Kanan with Sabine. That still deals 1 damage to Paul's base with the on-attack trigger, and 4 damage back onto Sabine. Paul has just claimed the initiative, and Blake will play Metal Ceremony, giving Sabine 1 experience token. So Paul opting to not play any cards last turn, taking the initiative. He does still have Yoda on the board, and even with the experience token that Blake put on Sabine with the Metal Ceremony, Sabine only has 2 HP remaining, which means Yoda could take her out, and that is what Yoda will do. Yoda comes across the board with a hit on Sabine. That will defeat Sabine. 3 damage back onto Yoda, and Paul back to no damage on his base. And Blake has had enough of Yoda. He is going to use the epic action on the Energy Conversion Lab, playing Steadfast Battalion, giving him ambush, and Yoda has been ambushed off the board by the Steadfast Battalion. And that allowed 4 damage to go through from the Overwhelm on Steadfast Battalion, because Yoda had just 1 HP remaining. So the other 4 damage from Steadfast Battalion's attack goes to Paul's base. 4 damage on each base now. Now it is Paul's action to take. He has 5 resources. He is going to use the Han action ability. This is going to bring him up to 6 resources, which will allow him to deploy Han this turn. Blake will quickly come across the board with K2SO. 4 damage into Paul's base, and Paul will deploy Han Solo. Blake claims the initiative, and now Paul has free reign to do what he wills the remainder of this turn. He has a ready Han Solo leader unit and 7 available resources. And the rest of the actions for this phase will be for Paul to make. Han Solo can attack and defeat one of the threats in the ground arena that Blake has. And that is the decision here. Steadfast Battalion is hitting for more per turn, but K2SO does have the when defeated ability as well, and Han is going to go ahead and attack the K2SO, defeating the Rebel droid. And that is 3 more damage onto Paul's base with the when defeated trigger. And Paul will play another Yoda. And now Paul trying to decide if he wants to make another play. He will pass at this point. He did forget the on-attack trigger from Han Solo, so that was him taking the top card of his deck, putting it into play as a resource. And now Paul will take a look through his resources, as he must defeat 2 of them. Whenever you use the Han Solo action ability or the on-attack trigger happens, and you get the extra resources, you have to defeat that number of resources at the start of the next action phase. So Paul back down to 6 resources. And the first action will be on Blake's side, as Blake does have the initiative. He is going to take the Steadfast Battalion and attack Yoda. That will defeat the Jedi. And 1 damage from the Overwhelm will go through to Paul's base, 12 damage on, and then Paul's going to take Han Solo and attack Blake's base for 4 damage. 8 damage on Blake's base now. Both players still have 6 ready resources. And Blake is going to play another copy of Steadfast Battalion. And here comes a quick response from Paul, playing the 7-cost Han Solo with ambush, ambushing and defeating the Steadfast Battalion that was just played. No damage back to Han Solo. Of course, Paul able to play the 7-cost unit there because he first attacked with his leader unit. And the Han Solo leader unit gave him that additional resource, allowing him to play the bigger version of Han. Very strong play for Paul. The initiative still on Blake's side of the table, but he is staring down some pretty big threats in Paul's ground arena. Both players considering what card they want to resource, as Paul will go up to 8 resources, and then he must defeat 1 of them. Blake does not resource. He will remain at 6 total resources. But generally with Sabine, you are not going to a high resource count. To start the turn, Blake will play a heroic sacrifice, giving Steadfast Battalion +2 attack. He gets to draw a card, and he gets to attack with the Steadfast Battalion, and that will allow him to trade with the 7 cost Han Solo unit. Blake definitely had to deal with that very large threat. But Paul, still with the Han Solo leader unit on board, will attack Blake's base for another 4 damage. He will get an 8th resource for this turn. And Blake responds with a Zeb Aurelios into the ground arena. Blake, with no remaining resources, will very likely claim the initiative if Paul takes another action. Paul does have 8 ready resources. He has 3 cards in hand. It looks like Vigilance is one of the cards he is holding on to. I can't quite tell what the other 2 are. And Paul is just going to claim the initiative. And it seems Paul is wanting to answer Zeb before Blake gets a chance to do any damage with him. Paul defeating a resource. And now the first action to Paul. We've got 13 damage on Paul's base, 12 damage on Blake's base. Blake with the 1-0 lead here in game 2 of round 7. And Paul going to continue to put the pressure on Blake. He is going to start the turn with an attack. Han Solo into Blake's base. That's 16 damage on now. Paul will get another resource that gives him 9 resources he can use on this turn. And now Blake has to decide what to do with Zeb. Does he go 5 damage into Paul's base, or does he take out Han Solo? Right now, Blake's only 9 damage away from losing this game, so he has to kind of do some damage control here, and that is what he will do. He attacks and defeats Han Solo, but that puts 4 damage back on Zeb, and Paul with an immediate make an opening, giving Zeb -2/-2. That will defeat Zeb and heal 2 damage from Paul's base. Blake plays K2SO. Paul responds with Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then a red 3 into the space arena for Blake. And Paul will take the initiative. And that Obi-Wan Kenobi will be trouble for Blake. It's going to be tough for him to get around Obi-Wan. Paul has the initiative, 16 damage on Blake's base. He is going to start with Vigilance. Vigilance will defeat the red 3. And the other option chosen by Paul is to give a shield token to Obi-Wan Kenobi. And now Obi-Wan will be extremely difficult to deal with for Blake. Blake will put some more pressure in the space arena with Green Squadron A-Wing, but here comes Obi-Wan Kenobi. 4 damage to Blake's base. That's 20 damage on now. Blake will play another Zeb. And then another unit into the ground arena for Paul as well. He plays Ezra Bridger. And Blake will play an R2-D2. Look at the top card. He will put that top card onto the bottom of his deck, and he will attack Obi-Wan Kenobi with K2SO. That will defeat K2SO and deal 3 damage to Paul's base off of the when-defeated trigger. Paul has the initiative once again, and he just needs 5 more damage to Blake's base to force a game 3. Paul starts this turn with an attack using Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's 4 damage into Blake's base. 24 damage on now, 1 damage shy of forcing a game 3. And with Blake's next action, he has to find a way to answer Ezra. He has Zeb, which Zeb can deal 4 damage to Ezra if he attacks and defeats Obi-Wan. And here's the Rebel Assault. So Blake will play Rebel Assault. That gives Zeb +1, allows him to attack into Obi-Wan Kenobi with 6 power. That will defeat Obi-Wan Kenobi. And that will trigger Obi-Wan's when defeated ability, which is going to allow Paul to give Ezra Bridger 2 experience tokens, which means that the 4 damage from Zeb will not be enough to defeat him. Paul also gets to draw a card. And then the second attack that Rebel Assault allows Blake to take in this situation, he will use the R2-D2 to attack Ezra with 2 power, and that will be the final amount of damage needed to defeat Ezra, and Blake has done it. He has managed to wipe out Paul's board and keep the game going. So Zeb still on the board with 4 damage. He has 1 HP remaining, and Blake also has a ready Green Squadron A-Wing in the space arena. The action back over to Paul. He is going to play a Vigilance, defeating the Green Squadron A-Wing, and he will heal 5 damage from his base, taking him back down to the single digits. Just 9 damage on Paul's base. Blake will play a Battlefield Marine, and there is a Millennium Falcon for Paul. That could finish the game. Blake has no response, and Paul has taken game 2, and we will have a deciding game 3 here in round 7 at SCG CON Richmond. The players are ready for what will be a deciding Game 3 here in Round 7 at the Star Wars Unlimited 4K at SCG CON Richmond. One of these 2 players will remain undefeated 7 rounds through. Again, just one more round before the cut to top 16.
That's not what I like to do, I'll be honest.
Both of these players have played extremely well and are giving us a great show here in the Round 7 feature match. It is super exciting to see this match go the distance, and we get some more Star Wars Unlimited action. In Game 2, it was a very rough start for Blake. He mulliganed into a hand that had no turn 1 play. Now we see both players have mulliganed here in Game 3 as well, but last game, no turn 1 play for Blake, and then Paul ramps into Yoda on turn 1 with the Han action ability. Then he uses the Han action ability on turn 2 to ramp into Kanan Jarrus. And at that point against Sabine, you would probably think that game is going to be a blowout, but it really was not. Blake was able to make a good game of it, keep some pressure on Paul, and really made Paul work for that victory to force this Game 3. And here in Game 3, Blake has found a turn 1 play. He plays the 2-cost Sabine unit into the ground arena, and Paul will follow up with a restored arc in space. Blake still has the initiative, and he will come across the board with Sabine for his first action. 3 damage to Paul's base. And I am sure that Blake is much more comfortable right now starting with the initiative, having a turn 1 play, and starting to play out the strategy that he is looking for in the game plan that he has with Sabine. Turn 2, Fighters for Freedom coming down onto the board for Blake, and Paul will respond with a Yoda. So Paul is threatening with a total of Restore 3 on his board, Restore 2 on Yoda, Restore 1 on Restored Arc. So Paul could potentially heal 3 damage a turn with this setup. And I don't think Blake wants anything to do with it. We're going to see the epic action on Energy Conversion Lab. Here comes K2SO. He will come into play and ambush Yoda off the board. K2SO defeating Yoda. And that is going to be 1 damage to Paul's base off of the Fighters for Freedom trigger when K2SO is played. And Paul does draw a card off of the when defeated trigger on Yoda. And after Blake's K2SO play, Paul will play a Spark of Rebellion. He gets to look at Blake's hand and discard a card. He sees Rebel Assault, R2-D2, and General Dodonna. Paul will have Blake discard the General Dodonna, knowing that Dodonna was a very real problem in the first game. General Dodonna really helped Blake get the momentum he needed to kind of carry him through to victory. And Paul wants no part of that here in Game 3. So after Blake attacks Paul's base with a Fighters for Freedom, Paul's going to play a Devotion onto Restored Arc, which is going to allow Restored Arc to heal 3 damage from Paul's base on each attack. Blake attacks Paul's base with Sabine, 3 damage to Paul's base, and then Paul immediately answers that 3 damage, hitting Blake's base for 3 damage with Restored Arc and healing 3 from his own. We do see Sabine action ability being used, 1 damage to each base. After Paul claims the initiative, Blake then deploys Sabine as well, and then attack with Sabine for another 3 damage onto Paul's base. The damage totals 10 damage on Paul's base, 6 damage on Blake's base. Quite an interesting turn with a number of changes to the damage totals on each base. Again, Paul with the Restored Arc in the Space Arena and a Devotion attached to it. Each time he attacks with Restored Arc, he is dealing 3 damage to Blake's base and healing 3 from his own. Now with that being said, Paul is still facing down an onslaught in the ground arena. Paul's first action of the turn, he will play a takedown, defeating the Sabine leader unit. That does answer one of the threats, but Blake still has 3 more units ready in the ground arena. And Blake's first action of the turn, he will attack Paul's base for 4 damage with K2SO, and then Paul will respond attacking Blake's base with the Restored Arc. 3 damage to Blake's base, healing 3 damage from Paul's base. And then Blake will put that 3 damage right back onto Paul's base, attacking with the Fighters for Freedom. 14 damage on Paul's base. And Blake still has a ready 2-cost Sabine in play. It looks as though Paul will use the Han Solo action ability, which I believe is the first time he's used it here in Game 3. And this game has had a much different feel than Game 2 when Paul was able to play that early Yoda and Kanan Jarrus. So after the Han Solo action ability, Blake will attack Paul's base for 3 damage using Sabine. And then Paul will heal that 3 damage with a repair. But here comes a Steadfast Battalion into the ground arena. Another very real threat for Blake. Paul will deploy Han. Blake claims. And now Paul will have to decide which threat to deal with. He decides to attack the Fighters for Freedom with Han Solo. He will get an extra resource and 3 damage back onto Han. And that will finish the turn. Blake will be starting with the initiative here on this next turn. He has a Steadfast Battalion, K2SO, and Sabine in the ground arena. Paul is still healing 3 damage a turn with the Restored Arc. And Paul also has Han Solo leader unit still in play. And the first action for Blake. Blake will take the Steadfast Battalion and attack Han Solo. And with the Overwhelm, that's going to put 2 damage onto Paul's base and defeat Han Solo. And then in response, Restored Arc coming back across the board. 3 damage to Blake's base. And take 3 damage off of Paul's base. 13 damage on Paul's base. 12 damage on Blake's base. And Blake's next action will be playing a red 3 into the space arena. And here comes Vigilance. Paul with a timely Vigilance. He will need to defeat a unit. It's going to be the red 3 that was just played, and he will heal 5 damage from his base. Back down to just 8 damage on. And Blake responds with a Rebel Assault. That's going to be some damage coming through. He will attack with K2SO first. That'll be 5 damage to Paul's base. And then attack with Sabine. That's 4 more damage. 9 total damage with that attack. 17 damage on Paul's base. Paul just claims the initiative. And another important card for Blake, the Medal Ceremony, coming down, giving K2SO and Sabine an experience token. And now that 3 damage that Paul is healing a turn, it just may not be enough. Blake is threatening with a total of 14 damage being shown right now in the ground arena. Paul's first action will be make an opening. That's going to slow things down a bit, giving Steadfast Battalion -2/-2. That will defeat the battalion and heal 2 damage from Paul's base. And Blake will pay 1 to play a Heroic Sacrifice. That is going to allow him to draw a card and attack with K2SO, giving K2SO +2 attack, so 7 damage to Paul's base. And then it will defeat K2SO, and that's going to allow Blake to deal another 3 damage to Paul's base, 25 damage on, and he still has a ready Sabine. But there is a takedown for Paul that will answer Sabine. Now the action back over to Blake. Here comes another copy of K2SO, leaving the door open for Paul to swing with Restored Arc. 3 damage to Blake's base for 15 total. And Paul will heal 3 damage back to 22 damage in total. Blake will start with the initiative. He just needs 8 damage to win this game. Can Paul stabilize? And there's another Heroic Sacrifice for Blake. That is going to be the final amount of damage needed, 9 total. And Blake has done it here in Game 3. He wins 2-1 over Paul in Round 7 and is the last undefeated player here at SCG CON Richmond. Thank you so much for joining me today for the Round 7 feature match. Stay tuned for Round 8 coming soon. May the Force be with you, and until next time, take care.